And we're picking back up on Bitten, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons by Chris Newby. Where were we? The hunt. Out of the abyss. Well, first, a transparent model of the 8-ball, a 1 million liter sphere used to test aerosolized agents at Fort Detrick, or the National Cancer Institute. Chapter 9. Out of the Abyss, Palo Alto, California, 2002. Illness is the night side of life. A more onerous citizenship. Everyone who is born holds dual citizenship. In the kingdom of the well and in the kingdom of the sick, although we all prefer the use of good passport. Although we all prefer the use of the good passport, sooner or later each of us is obliged, at least for a spell, to identify ourselves as citizens of the other place. Susan Sontag, Illness as a Metaphor. 14 days after picnicking with our family on Nashawina Island, Paul and I came down with an intense flu-like illness. It started with malaise, fatigue, intestinal discomfort, sore muscles, muscle twitching, neck pain, blurry vision, and sensitivity to light. I had a non-itchy pinprick rash on my lower legs. We were in our early 40s, athletic and fit, and this was the sickest we'd ever felt in our lives. Luckily, our boys were fine. We went to see an on-call physician at our community clinic, whom I'll call Dr. A. I suggested that we might have Lyme disease, even though we hadn't noticed any tick bites. Dr. A said she thought it was a virus. Our blood was drawn to see if various blood components and cells were within a standard range, and she said the results were normal. She told us to come back if we didn't get better. Our symptoms intensified, and we went back to Dr. A the next week. Before our visit, she had consulted with an infectious disease specialist at the clinic. Dr. B told her that Lyme was a rare disease and that our symptoms were different from those described by the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. We probably had a lingering viral infection, so Dr. A had our blood scanned, and again she said the results were normal. 11 days later, I called Dr. A yet again. I'm sure she could hear the desperation in my voice. 6 weeks after our visit to the island, we were still extremely sick with the same symptoms as in the beginning: fatigue, intestinal pain, sore muscles, muscle twitching, neck pain, blurry vision, and sensitivity to light. She gave us a referral to see the infectious disease specialist, Dr. B, in person. Finally, on December 5th, more than 4 months after our vacation, Dr. B met with both Paul and me in one of his exam rooms. He wore a rumpled white coat and khaki pants and seemed ill at ease. He spent no more than 10 minutes with us and never physically touched us. He tested us for parvovirus, but the results were negative. Then he prescribed 20 days worth of a drug that kills intestinal parasites. We were relieved when this drug eliminated our symptoms, but 3 days after the pills ran out, they came back in full force. I asked for another round, but without a specific diagnosis. Dr. B said he couldn't treat us based on positive reactions to drugs. 100 years ago, doctors didn't have sophisticated lab tents or names for all the microbes that might make a person sick. Their approach was more intuitive. They'd listen to a patient's symptoms, try a treatment, and if it didn't work, they'd try another until a person got better. In our for-profit medical system, there's little patience for this. Dr. B, a busy, expensive infectious disease specialist, probably considered a healthy-looking couple with vague chronic symptoms a waste of his time. He obviously didn't understand how much we were suffering. In January 2003, 5 months after the island visit, our condition worsened. Our condition continued to worsen. We had brain fog. We couldn't think, multitask, or remember simple things. The crushing fatigue continued. Our necks felt like they were locked in vice grips. Paul's symptoms were more muscle and joint related. He didn't have the strength to lift his leg over a bike or press the trigger of a portable drill. Mine were more neurological. I was no longer capable of reading books aloud to my son before bedtime. It was too hard to get the words on the page out of my mouth. My brain also had trouble processing space and time. I'd run into the side of doorways and had trouble recalling the current month or year. Day after day, we felt ourselves sliding into an abyss of fear and hopelessness. How could the medical system be so heartless? Debilitated by fatigue, my husband, nonetheless, kept dragging himself to work. After we all needed the health insurance his job provided to pay for specialists and tests, one day he was writing an engineering schedule on a whiteboard in front of his coworkers. While he lost his sense of time, place, and self, he had no idea what he had been talking about. He turned and looked at his puzzled colleague for a few awkward moments, then left the room. Over the next 6 months, the fatigue and brain fog worsened. We got lost in our own neighborhood, became sensitive to sound as well as light, and experienced roaring tinnitus in our ears. Muscle twitches and tendon pain. Our intestines were on fire, and we suffered through cyclical bouts of constipation and explosive diarrhea. Eventually, I had to shut down my consulting business, but I couldn't file for state disability because I didn't have a doctor who would verify that I had an incapacitating disease. With Paul and me both crawling into bed by 7 o'clock most evenings, our middle school boys had to learn to fend for themselves. Our family income now cut in half. We depleted our savings and the kids' college funds to pay for our bills. We became social pariahs, unable to carry conversations with friends or do anything physically beyond the bare-bones tasks needed to keep our family alive. Only years later did we articulate our fears to each other. We both felt as if we were dying, and we were terrified for our children. Back on our case, Dr. B sent us to a gastrointestinal specialist who listened to our symptoms and told us that he thought we had a bacterial infection. I left a tearful message on Dr. B's voicemail begging him to let us try antibiotics again. Reluctantly, he prescribed 20 days of doxycycline, the recommended antibiotic for treating early Lyme disease. It miraculously eliminated our symptoms, but 3 weeks after the drug ran out, neurological symptoms, old and new, hit us like a ton of bricks. Now, along with the same symptoms as before, it felt like we had Alzheimer's disease. Our short-term memory was seriously impaired, and I could no longer read. I would lose my shopping cart in the grocery store or get out of my car and leave the engine running. One day I found myself at a stoplight, unable to remember what red, yellow, and green lights meant. Rather than admit defeat, Dr. B decided that I was an attention-seeking, hysterical female whose husband was suffering from sympathy pains. He diagnosed us with a psychosomatic couples thing. It was time to find a new doctor. I spent weeks pulling strings to get an appointment with an with another infectious disease specialist, this one at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Our first two appointments were with a young physician fellow whom I'll call Dr. C. He conducted a thorough medical history and then, with the help of a senior attending physician, Dr. D, ordered a battery of tests. A few weeks later, I sat down with Dr. C in his office. He pulled out a folder and slowly flipped through test pages, reading the results aloud. Brain MRI negative, syphilis negative, HIV/AIDS negative, histoplasmosis negative, coccidioidomycosis, coccidioidomycosis. Never read that before, obviously. Negative. Histoplasmosis, negative. Cryptosporidium, negative. When he closed the folder, I asked, "What about Lyme tests?" He told us that Lyme antibody screening test was positive for me and negative for my husband. He said that the positive didn't mean anything because it was an unreliable test, a false positive. When I mentioned that the CDC recommended that a positive Lyme screening test be followed up with the second step of testing, something called a Western blot, Dr. C ordered these tests for me. A week later, the first one came back positive again, and the second one was negative. He didn't think we had Lyme disease. Currently, we are at a loss for a definitive diagnosis, although Dr. I and G Lyme antibody titer is abnormal, wrote the Stanford doctors to our community physicians. During my final appointment, Dr. C told me you'd have more chance of winning the lottery than both of you getting Lyme disease. He strongly suggested recommending that we both seek psychological counseling for the depression we were experiencing. Dr. D came in at the end of the appointment, handed me a box of tissues and said, "Sorry we don't have the tools to fix what is wrong with you." Then he dismissed us as patients. We had no place to go, and out of despair and desperation, I turned to the internet. As a long-time resident of Silicon Valley, I knew not to trust everything I found on the internet, but I soon discovered a tight-knit community of Lyme patients advocates. Angels of Mercy dedicated to helping patients like us. As soon as I typed in my symptoms and test results on the message board of an internet chat room, someone explained how unreliable the Lyme tests were and sent me the name of a Lyme literate physician practicing a few miles from my house. Fortunate. Christine Green, MD, a wisp of a woman with flyaway blonde hair and intelligent blue eyes, had trained at Stanford. She had treated thousands of patients with tick-borne diseases. Her waiting list was months long, and she didn't take medical insurance. During my first meeting with her in her office, I had just handed her my symptoms timeline and was recounting my case history when she stopped me and said, "I think you have Lyme disease. Let's run some tests to make sure." Then she conducted a 2-hour medical history and a hands-on physical looking for symptoms common to her neurological Lyme disease patients. A typical presentation might include fatigue, cognitive dysfunction, brain fog, memory, attention, speech errors, and cranial nerve asymmetries. On one side of her face droops or twitches, jerky eye movements. This preliminary diagnosis was supported by subsequent Lyme tests and a SPECT, S-P-E-C-T, brain scan that showed inflammation was restricting blood flow on one side of my brain. That day was the beginning of a 5-year treatment regimen that slowly brought me back to health. It had taken us a year, 10 doctors, and $60,000 in medical expenses, but we had finally been diagnosed with 2 tick-borne infections: Lyme disease babesiosis, a malaria-like parasite disease caused by Babesia, both prevalent in Martha's Vineyard. In hindsight, I think the tick that bit me also carried a rickettsia, the pinprick rash that appeared on my lower legs, and the chronically weeping sore beneath my hairline called an eschar, a wound often found at the site of a rickettsia infected tick bite, were both symptoms of such. Wait, was that symptoms? Yes. Let's just start that over. A wound often found at the site of a rickettsia infected tick bite were both symptoms of such an infection. A year later, we discovered that the first 3 blood scans Dr. A had run on us weren't in fact normal, as we'd been told. This was before patients' test results became available online, but rather they showed an unusually low level of neutrophils, a common type of white blood cell important in fighting off infections, a possible sign of babesiosis. If our first doctor had been better informed about tick-borne diseases, and if she'd treated us with a course of doxycycline soon after, none of our subsequent suffering would have happened. We didn't know it at the time, but this scenario was happening across the country, and no one was tracking the outcomes of abandoned patients like us, because we were being treated outside of the medical system. As things stand in today's American medical system, it's difficult for a person to be treated for Lyme disease unless they happened to notice a bullseye rash or a test positive to both parts of the 2-tiered Lyme test. Unfortunately, the diagnostic protocol is so poorly designed that legions of truly sick patients are misdiagnosed each year. A 2007 article in the British Medical Journal succinctly described the situation that still exists today. The 2-tier testing system endorsed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, has a high specificity, 99%, and yields few false positives, but the tests have a uniformly miserable sensitivity, 56%. They miss 88 of every 200 patients with Lyme disease. By comparison, AIDS tests have a sensitivity of 99.5%. They miss only 1 of every 200 AIDS cases. And in simple terms, the chance of a patient with Lyme disease being diagnosed using the commercial tests approved by the Food and Drug Administration and sanctioned by the CDC is about getting heads or tails when tossing a coin, and the poor test performance assures that many patients with Lyme disease will go undiagnosed. Very sad. To add insult to injury, when you are bitten by an unseen tick that regurgitates an unknown number of disease-causing germs into your bloodstream, you become a walking medical mystery to your primary care physician. There are very few published studies to help doctors identify symptoms of mixed germ infections. Finding all tick-borne diseases is low compared to other serious infectious diseases. In 2016, the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, and the CDC spent $77,355 and $20,293, respectively, per new surveillance case of HIV/AIDS, and $36,063 and $11,459 per new case of hepatitis C virus, yet only $768 and $302 for each new case of Lyme disease. After a grueling year of testing and drug cocktails, I was healthy enough to begin asking questions about what many refer to as the Lyme Wars. My desire to help others avoid our family's ordeal motivated me to work with Andy Abrams Wilson of Open Eye Pictures to help produce the Lyme disease documentary Under Our Skin. Gotta watch that. At the beginning of this 4-year project, Andy and I attended a Lyme patient conference in Reston, Virginia. Before the opening talk, we announced that we were looking for Lyme patients to feature in the film. Almost 100 signed up to share their stories, and we wanted to get as many of them as we could. On camera. We hadn't brought professional backdrops for the shoot, so we had a hotel housekeeper get us a white tablecloth, which we then stapled to a wall of the conference room. We put a chair in front of the sheet, and Andy asked each patient to sit and tell us their story. We spent the next 2 days in the dark, filming 62 Lyme patient testimonials. Many of these stories moved us to tears, and Andy and I started calling these powerful interviews the White Sheets. For us, they captured the raw emotional and physical experiences of those suffering from a variety of devastating tick-borne diseases. These patients became the chorus of voices in the documentary, the collective story of the people over whom the mainstream medical profession had pulled a white sheet. In February 2007, after 2 years of trying, Andy and I still weren't able to get any government Lyme experts on camera. We'd contacted the CDC, the NIH, Rocky Mountain Labs, and Professor Alan Barbour from the University of California, Irving, and former Rocky Mountain Lab scientists who helped isolate the first Lyme spirochete in Long Island ticks. The politics of the disease were too charged, and the government researchers seemed to want to steer clear of the controversy. Our only hope was to find a retired NIH Lyme expert who would talk. This led us to Hamilton, Montana, to interview Willie Bergdorfer, who seemed eager to tell his story. We arrived at Willie's front door on a bitterly cold day. What followed was a candid interview about Lyme disease, its dangers, and its controversies. Willie told us that the United States government knows that Lyme disease can become chronic and that patients can relapse after an initial infection, and that the disease is partially damaging to the neurological system in children. He then criticized the dozen or so researchers who receive most of the NIH funding set aside for Lyme disease, saying, "The controversy in Lyme disease research is a shameful affair, and I say that because the whole thing is politically tainted. Money goes to the people who have, for the past 30 years, produced the same thing, nothing. Serology, blood analysis, has to be started from scratch with people, meaning scientists, who don't know beforehand the results of their research." As soon as we turned off the camera and began packing up our gear, Willie told us with a weary smile, "I didn't tell you everything." But try as we might, we couldn't get him to say more. This was the unfinished business that haunted us as we rushed to complete the film. We had been working on it for years, and we had only a few months to finish it for the film festival deadlines. It was time to get it out into the world. The documentary premiered at the 2008 Tribeca Film Festival, won more than 20 awards, and made it to the 2010 Oscar nomination shortlist. Even without the thing that Willie didn't tell us, the film has been watched by millions of people all around the world on Netflix and public television, in town halls and libraries, and at professional conferences and policy institutes, bringing the tragedy of Lyme disease out of the shadows and increasing awareness in an unprecedented way. It also has helped patients understand that in the current medical environment, they might have to fight to get tested and treated for their illness. And for many people sick with Lyme disease, the film also marked the first time they found out they were not alone. A few months after the Oscar promotional effort, I was hired to write about scientific research at Stanford University School of Medicine. I was happy to move on to a new topic, to let others carry the torch on Lyme disease education. I was exhausted. Then in June 2013, I received an express mail package I couldn't ignore. When I opened it, I realized I wasn't done with Lyme disease. Chapter 10, Confession. Wherever, 22nd. Palo Alto, California, 2013. How guilt redefined the methods of self-torture, threading the beads of detail into an eternal loop, a rosary to be fingered for a lifetime. Ian McCowan, Atonement. I ripped open the express mail envelope that arrived via Saturday delivery mail to my home in Palo Alto, California. Inside was a DVD with Lord of the Rings scrawled across its face in felt marker. I took it into my family room, closed the drapes, and slid it into my player. A grainy video frame opened on an old man dressed in a pale green golf shirt, sitting in an easy chair. Wispy white hairs formed a halo on his head. He was missing a few teeth. "I'm Willy Bergdorfer," he said in a thick Swiss German accent, his voice distorted by an uncooperative tongue, a symptom of advanced Parkinson's disease. "I was born in Switzerland. Then, after I studied at the University of Basel, I had the opportunity to go to the United States. I traveled in 1951 to Rocky Mountain Lab, the place where I worked on arthropod-borne diseases on the vectors that transmit the various agents of disease." Behind the camera, the man asking questions was Tim Gray, 44, an indie filmmaker and rock musician. He wore skinny jeans, a crisp white t-shirt, and a 2-day beard. Black-rimmed glasses were propped up on his shaved beard. He had just driven 33 hours non-stop from Traverse City, Michigan to Willie's home in Hamilton, Montana. Gray was on a mission. His sister had died of complications related to Lyme disease, and in 2009 he made a documentary about it called Under the Eight Ball, which hypothesized that the Lyme disease epidemic may have been started by a bioweapons accident gone awry. While the project was well-intentioned, the evidence for its premise was weak. 4 years later, Gray met with Willie to find out what he knew. Gray's young female assistant controlled 2 cameras during the interview. Sometimes the video shifts to a split-screen format, which shows Gray asking questions in one frame and Willie responding in another. In the video, Gray goes through the motions of asking Willie about his scientific career. about his investigation into the sick children of Lyme, Connecticut, who were stricken with crippling fatigue and joint pain in the mid-1970s, about other diseases carried by ticks. Then, an hour or so into the interview, the tenor of the exchange shifts, and he asks Willie about his early research infecting ticks with disease agents for biological weapons program work that was virtually unknown to Willie's friends, family, or colleagues. Gray had found out about this side of Willie's work in a few old journal articles from the 1950s about his artificially feeding dangerous microbes to ticks. Reading between the lines, Gray had gathered that the experiments were part of the U.S. bioweapons program, and he thought he could use them with Willie as a crowbar to get the truth. Let's take your scientific work studies that I have discovered that were published in 1952 and 1956, Gray said. One being the intentional infecting of ticks, the second being the recombination of 4 different pathogens, 2 being spirochetal, and 2 being viral. From a simple procedural standpoint, I think it's safe to assume that the purpose of those studies at the height of the Cold War, on the heels of World War I, was to ensure that we were able to keep up with the rest of the world from a biological warfare standpoint. Did you question that? Willie paused, then replied, Question, has Borrelia burgdorferi have the potential for biological warfare? As tears welled up in Willie's eyes, he continued, looking at the data it already has. If the organism stays within the system, you won't even recognize what it is. In your lifespan, it can explode. We evaluated, you never deal with that as a scientist. You can sleep better. Later on in the video, Gray circled back to this topic and asked, if there's an emergence of a brand new epidemic that has the tenets of all those things that you put together, do you feel responsible for that? Yeah, it sounds like throughout the 38 years I may have. The lab director telephoned me. This is director, so and so. How come I couldn't read that? I got somebody here from the FBI. Will you come down and ask a few questions? Exactly the same thing. I recall all these discussions, Willie said. Finally, after 3 hours and 14 minutes, Gray asked him the one question, the only question he really cares about. Was the pathogen that you found in the tick, the Allen Steere, the Lyme outbreak investigator, gave you the same pathogen or similar, or a generational mutation of the one you published in the paper from 1952? In response, Willie closed his arms defensively, took a deep breath, and stared into the camera for 43 seconds and an eternity. Then he looked away, down, and to the right, and he appeared to be working through an internal debate. The left side of his mouth briefly curled up, as if he is thinking, oh well. Then anger flashes across his face. Yeah, he said, more in German than in English. It was a stunning admission from one of the world's foremost authorities on Lyme disease. If it was true, it meant that Willie had left our essential data from his scientific articles on the Lyme disease outbreak, and that as the disease spread like wildfire in the Northeast and Great Lakes region of the United States, he was part of the cover-up of the truth. He seemed to be saying that Lyme wasn't a naturally occurring germ, one that may have gotten loose and been spread by global warming, an explosion of deer, and other environmental changes. It had been created in a military bioweapons lab for the specific purpose of harming human beings, and somehow it had gotten out. At the end of the interview, Gray grilled him for almost 4 hours. Willie wiped tears from his eyes. With that one-word confession, he had opened the door to a possible explanation for the complexities of Lyme that had eluded activists, journalists, physicians, and scientists for more than 30 years. Gray turned off his camera, but not the other, and began picking up gear with his assistant. In the half-light of the fading summer day, the second camera shows Willie as he stares off at some invisible point in the distance. His face sags. A wind chime sounds outside the window, and he lifts his head. The winds are blowing out of the canyons, he says, looking out of the window toward the jagged sawtooth range of the Bitterroot Mountains. Then the video cuts to black. I turned off my TV screen and sat in the dark. I was stunned based on what I had just seen in the video. I believed that Willie was telling the truth, a truth that had been eating away at his soul for more than 30 years. Gray had sent me the video because he wanted my help with his investigation. I hesitated. I had battled Lyme disease for 7 years and had been symptom-free for 3. And while I was recovering, I had spent 3.5 years working on the Lyme disease documentary. Now I wanted to move on. I had a great job writing about the latest advances in medical research at Stanford University. My kids were almost finished with college. Let someone else carry this torch. I needed boring, safe normalcy. Still, I felt a nagging guilt that the documentary had missed its mark, and if Willie's claims were true, a crime against humanity had been committed by the United States government and then covered up. If the full story weren't told, millions more Lyme patients would suffer. Someone needed to dig out the truth, and I figured that someone was me. Let's see how many we'll pick. Chapter 11, Missing Files. National Archives, College Park, Maryland, 2013. Research is formalized curiosity. It's poking and prying with a purpose. Zora Neale Hurston. Dust tracks on a road. I crossed the threshold of this story when I entered the cavernous reading room of the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. It was a cloudy day, and sunlight dimly washed over the library tables arranged along a 2-story wall of glass. There were a few researchers scattered about, table lamps illuminating their faces. What struck me was the silence in the towering room, a cathedral dedicated to the freedom of information. I was here to look for evidence that supported Willie's reluctant and vague admission that Lyme disease was a biological weapon. As luck would have it, a few weeks later, I watched the Gray interview video. I received a tip from a government lawyer friend of mine who manages an online database of Freedom of Information Act requests. He told me that the Willie Bergdorfer papers had recently been released by the NIH to the National Archives 6 years after I had initially requested access to them. Security at the archives was tight. To get in, all new visitors had to go through an online registration process to obtain a photo ID card, and everyone had to watch a computer-based tutorial to learn the rules. No bags, books, notepads, purses, papers, pens, highlighters, or sticky notes were allowed in the research room. Only cameras and pencils for use on blue archives paper. Between the archives lobby and research room, there are 2 security check stations guard check IDs, and ink stamp papers taken in and out of the room, verifying that only personal notes, not archived documents, are removed. Roving guards patrol the research room floor, on the lookout for violations. Once I was inside the reading room, it took about an hour for the archivists to deliver my documents, which had been shipped from a warehouse in Pennsylvania the previous day. Willie's research papers and lab notebooks, spanning a 34-year career at the Rocky Mountain Lab National Laboratory, were stored on 2 rolling carts, 33 archive boxes, each containing 500 to 800 pages, potentially 26,400 pieces of paper to review. I knew I needed help to go through everything in 4 days, which was all the time I could afford to take off work. But who understood Lyme disease enough to know what to look for and to keep it a secret? The first person I called was Pamela Weintraub, the author of Cure Unknown: Inside the Lyme Epidemic. At the time, she was a senior editor at Discover magazine in Manhattan. After almost a decade of book research, Weintraub knew more than anyone else about the science, history, and politics of Lyme disease. Over the years, she'd been a valued sounding board for my questions related to the disease. After I told her why I needed her help, the phone line went dead silent. Then, in her gravelly, hard-boiled New York City accent, she whispered, "If this is really true, it's an evil almost unimaginable. But your proof has to be rock solid or they will destroy you." When she said this to me, she was sitting at the hospital bedside of her ailing mother. The timing wasn't right for her to help, but if I were still researching my book, she told me, I'd go to the ends of the earth to dig out the truth. Next, I called Tim Gray after Pam. He was one of the few people who knew about the people, the science, and the controversy surrounding Lyme disease to be able to intelligently search through the Willy Bergdorfer papers. Always up for the adventure, he jumped at the invitation and we set a date. I was a few hours into the archives search when Tim called me from the building's lobby. He was having trouble getting through security, wearing dark sunglasses, a Baudouin scarf, a black t-shirt emblazoned with a white skull, and skinny jeans. He probably looked to the guard station there more like a terrorist than a historian. The two had just finished up an argument about archives rules. Tim had insisted that his scarf wasn't a scarf, that he couldn't hide documents as defined by archives rules. It was a neck wrap. Killing the guard with humor, Tim won the argument. When he met up with me in the reading room, he pointed to the white skull on his shirt, artwork from the cover of S.E. Hinton's book, The Outsiders. Then he said a little too loudly, "Hey Chris, I'm wearing a banned book t-shirt." Heads turned as I guided him to my library table. For the rest of the day, we settled into a routine. I worked my way through the first document cart, sifting through Willie's professional correspondence organized by name. Tim worked from the second cart, looking through the lab notebooks and microscopic images. If a page looked relevant, we'd photograph it and discuss it in whispers. I soon learned that Willie was a prolific letter writer and careful documenter of all his experiments throughout the years. The archived documents were neatly organized in folders and hand-labeled in pencil by an unknown archivist. Willie's numbered lab notebooks were on the second cart, and pages of his experiments were numbered and referenced back to folders with corresponding slide images. Tim was the first to note that some of the numbered slide images taken during the Lyme disease discovery were missing. There were several cases where a lab notebook page said an experiment had been done, but the relating image file just wasn't there. We took a coffee break and rest our strategy. Maybe we needed to start looking for the evidence holes, the documents that were missing from the boxes. I went back to the letters, organized in number folders, arranged alphabetically by name, and that's when I made an intriguing discovery. There was no folder for the person who was considered to be a co-worker of Lyme disease, Alan Steer, MD from Yale University. In the spot where the Steer folder should have been, there was a folder with an erased tab overwritten with the name of a different person. I wondered if Steer folder had been swapped out or removed. To explore this possibility, I asked the archivist if someone could have removed these files from the archive, and with a raised eyebrow she said impossible. We were the first people to review the Willy Bergdorfer papers, and if anything was missing, it would have happened before the documents arrived at the archives. I went back to discuss this with Tim, as he showed me his latest find, film negatives labeled The Swiss Agent. "What's this?" he said. "No idea," I said. The Swiss agent isn't mentioned in any of the letters. Just then I noticed a tattoo above Tim's elbow. "What's this?" I asked. He really looked at me in disbelief. "You don't know? Really? Really? It's from the Lorax, the Dr. Seuss book," said a security guard who was walking behind us. Tim laughed too loudly. Heads turned and he broadcasted to the crowd. "Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not," he said, quoting the Lorax, the fuzzy orange Dr. Seuss character who speaks for the trees, who sets out to save the planet from complete deforestation and environmental destruction. I nodded my head in approval. During the search, we looked through what seemed like every document, notebook, or image that Willie touched in his lifetime, except for his most important materials. Oddly, those associated with his 1981 Lyme disease discovery were missing. The documents closest to that time frame appeared to be a mysterious set of film negatives in a folder labeled The Swiss Agent. We held them up to the light and saw ghostly outlines of cells on a black background. The Swiss agent organisms floated inside the cells, tiny orbs glowing like fireflies. Eventually, I returned to my hotel, the Donovan named after William Wild Bill Donovan, one of the founders of the CIA, with a lobby decorated like a scene from a James Bond film. I took the elevator up to my room and pulled open the drapes to look out over the DC skyline, processing the day's events and trying to decide if I should take on this whole whistleblower story. My thoughts were interrupted by yelling from below. A parade of protesters was making its way around Thomas Circle, chanting, "Free Bradley Manning! Free Bradley Manning!" Oh, God. They were voicing concern over the incarceration of an Army soldier, now called Chelsea Manning, after her transition to female, for releasing more than 500,000 classified military and diplomatic documents to WikiLeaks, which the government decided was a violation of the Espionage Act of 1917. While this act had originally been designed to stop foreign spies and saboteurs, many journalists and lawyers were critical of its use by the government to retaliate against well-meaning whistleblowers such as Pentagon Papers leaker Daniel Ellsberg. The protest struck me as important The protest struck me as important at the time for reasons I wouldn't fully comprehend until much later. This criminalization of government whistleblowers would make it much harder for me to get people who had been involved in the biological weapons program to talk. I left the archive search wondering where the missing Lyme discovery files were and what the microscopic phantom and what this microscopic and what was this microscopic phantom? This Swiss agent messing up. I left the archives search wondering where the missing Lyme discovery files were and what this microscopic phantom, this Swiss agent was. The only person who could answer those questions was Willie, so I took a leap of faith and began planning a trip back to Montana to ask him more questions. And we'll pick up chapter 12 another day.